Snow falls differently at Versailles. It does not rush. It does not swirl. It settles. Each flake lands on stone that was never meant to feel cold, only admiration. The palace lies quiet now, its long horizontal body stretching across the winter ground like something asleep, or something preserved. Gold leaf dulls under a pale sky. Windows reflect nothing but gray. The gardens, once disciplined into obedience, surrender temporarily to white silence. There is no music. No court. No footsteps. Only the faint sound of wind slipping between statues that were carved to last forever. Versailles in winter is not triumphant. It is restrained. It waits. From a distance, the palace still performs its oldest trick. Scale overwhelms thought. The facade is almost aggressively symmetrical, repeating window after window after window, as if daring the eye to count them. Stone replaces horizon. Perspective collapses under its own ambition. Even emptied of people, it demands attention, the way a cathedral does, or a mountain. This is how power announces itself, not by shouting, but by refusing to be ignored. Inside, light filters through tall panes and touches polished floors that reflect ceilings painted with gods who once watched over kings. Chandeliers hang motionless, their crystals catching the smallest fragments of daylight, breaking it into harmless beauty. Everything appears intact. Clean. Maintained. Eternal. There are rooms here that exist only to impress. Rooms never slept in. Rooms never lived in. Rooms designed for walking slowly, for turning one's body into an object of observation. A choreography of awe. The Hall of Mirrors waits, as it always has. 357 mirrors line the wall, repeating space until reality feels uncertain. The garden beyond presses itself into the glass, multiplying trees, sky, clouds. Once, this room echoed with silk, with laughter, with the quiet violence of court politics disguised as elegance. Today, it holds only the sound of distant footsteps from a guide leading strangers through someone else's dream. Mirrors were not cheap. In the 17th century, France did not produce them at this scale. Venice did. And Venice guarded the secret like a weapon. To place mirrors here was not decoration. It was conquest by reflection. It was a declaration that no boundary, no industry, no craft lay beyond the reach of this place. Versailles was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be convincing. Convincing enough to bend nobility into obedience. Convincing enough to make distance feel irrelevant. Convincing enough to transform one man's authority into architecture. Outside, the gardens stretch outward in impossible geometry. Trees cut into submission. Water disciplined into lines and arcs. Fountains stand dormant now, but even silent they suggest motion, effort, force. Miles of canals reflect a sky that offers no answers. To make water rise here, where it never wanted to go, required machines. Not poetry. Not beauty. Machines. Pumps driven by animals. By men. By systems designed to fail and be repaired again and again. The fountains performed only when commanded. Only when the king was present. Water flowed for power, not pleasure. Maintenance was constant. Failure was expected. This palace was never finished. It was only ever sustained. Behind every polished surface lies repetition. Cleaning. Repairing. Replacing. A hidden rhythm that does not appear in paintings. The scraping of tools. The burning of fuel. The quiet exhaustion of labor that left no signature behind. Visitors rarely notice the seams. They are trained not to. Versailles teaches the eye what to see and what to forget. Grandeur upstairs. Silence downstairs. Celebration above. Machinery below. The building does not explain itself. It does not need to. It simply exists, and in existing, it suggests inevitability. As if this was always meant to be here. As if this much beauty could only ever have one outcome. But monuments lie. They lie by omission. They lie by endurance. They lie by surviving the people who paid for them. Versailles consumes time the way it once consumed money. Each year, millions pass through its gates, walking slowly, speaking softly, absorbing the narrative they were given: art, power, history, culture. Few ask how fragile this balance always was. Fewer still ask who carried it. Because cost is harder to preserve than stone. Ledgers fade. Bodies disappear. Silence fills the gaps. At night, when the palace closes and the last footsteps echo out of its corridors, Versailles becomes something else. Not a museum. Not a symbol. But a structure still demanding care. Still requiring electricity. Still drinking resources. Still imposing itself on the present. It has outlived the empire that built it. It has outlasted the crown that commanded it. It has survived revolutions, wars, republics. And yet, it still asks the same unspoken question it asked from the beginning. Who will pay to keep this dream alive? Because every dream this large does not end. It only changes hands. And beneath the snow, beneath the gold, beneath the silence, the cost never truly disappears. It only waits to be remembered. But what did this beauty cost? And more importantly, who actually paid for it? Before Versailles was stone, it was insecurity. Before the mirrors, the gardens, the endless corridors, there was a boy who learned early that power could vanish overnight. Louis de Udon was 4 years old when he became King of France. Too young to rule, too young to understand the crown placed on his head like a weight disguised as ceremony. His childhood unfolded not in stability, but in fear. Paris was restless. Nobles plotted openly. The Fronde erupted into rebellion, forcing the royal family to flee the capital under cover of darkness. The memory never left him. A child king watching angry crowds through carriage windows. Hearing doors barricaded. Feeling the absence of control long before understanding what control meant. Authority, he learned, was fragile. It could be challenged. It could be surrounded. It could be humiliated. Paris was dangerous. Paris was unpredictable. Paris remembered that kings were human. Louis would not forget that lesson. When he came of age, he ruled with intention sharpened by trauma. He did not seek merely to govern France. He sought to remove uncertainty itself. To build a world where power was visible, permanent, and undeniable. A world where proximity to the king replaced rebellion, where nobles would exhaust themselves competing for attention instead of organizing resistance. Versailles was not born from extravagance alone. It was born from fear. The site had once been a hunting lodge, modest, damp, unremarkable. A place of retreat, far enough from Paris to feel safe, close enough to remain relevant. Louis returned to it again and again, reshaping it slowly at first, then relentlessly, as his vision sharpened. This would not be a palace that blended into the landscape. It would dominate it. Louis XIV understood performance. He understood ritual. He understood the psychology of spectacle. Every movement of his body became political. Every appearance calculated. The Sun King was not a nickname. It was a strategy. The sun does not negotiate. It does not share the sky. Everything else orbits. Versailles would become that orbit. But this was not a man building only for pleasure. He built for containment. To gather the nobility under his roof, to keep them close, dependent, visible. To replace provincial power with courtly ritual. Here, ambition would be redirected into ceremony. Rivalry into etiquette. Rebellion into fashion. Loneliness hid beneath the grandeur. Louis surrounded himself with thousands, yet trusted few. Court life was intimate but impersonal. Everything was seen. Everything was overheard. Privacy became a privilege the king himself rarely enjoyed. His days followed rigid schedules, public awakenings, public meals, public rituals that turned his body into an object of state. Even the act of waking became political. At Versailles, nothing was small. Even emotion had scale. To hesitate was to weaken. To retreat was to invite memory, memory of fleeing Paris, of a frightened child carried through streets that did not bow. So he expanded. Each new wing pushed uncertainty further away. Each fountain asserted mastery over nature itself. Each corridor extended the distance between the king and the world that once threatened him. Legacy mattered deeply, obsessively. Louis did not believe in invisibility. He believed in being remembered. Stone was more reliable than people. Architecture did not betray. It obeyed, endured, reflected exactly what it was told to show. Time, he believed, could be disciplined. And yet, beneath the performance, there was a man aging under his own image. A king who outlived wives, children, lovers. A ruler who buried heirs and watched certainty erode despite all efforts to prevent it. The palace grew even as the future narrowed. Versailles became both sanctuary and prison. To leave it was to risk losing control. To stay was to remain at the center of a machine that required constant motion. Festivals, balls, hunts, ceremonies, endless affirmation that the sun still shone. That power still held. That the illusion remained intact. But illusions demand energy. The king rarely spoke of cost. He did not need to. Money, like obedience, flowed upward. The systems that fed Versailles were distant, abstract, safely invisible. Hunger occurred elsewhere. Taxes were collected far away. Suffering happened offstage. What mattered was that the palace worked. That it impressed. That it intimidated. That it endured. Versailles was not built because Louis loved beauty. It was built because he feared absence. Absence of control. Absence of reverence. Absence of himself. And so the dream hardened into stone, expanded into geometry, multiplied into reflections that suggested infinity where mortality waited patiently beneath the crown. Louis XIV would die in his bed at Versailles after 72 years on the throne. His final words were not about architecture. They were about responsibility. About continuity. About the weight of rule passing to a child once again. History repeated itself quietly. The palace remained. The dreamer disappeared. And the machine he built continued to turn, indifferent to the man who started it, demanding fuel from those who never entered its halls. Because Versailles was never just a dream. It was a system. And systems do not sleep. Versailles did not run on admiration. It ran on labor. Beneath the ceilings painted with gods and victories, beneath floors polished to reflect silk and candlelight, there existed another Versailles entirely. One without mirrors. One without music. A world of corridors too narrow for ceremony, of staircases never shown on maps, of rooms designed not for beauty but for function. This Versailles did not sleep. To keep the palace alive required bodies. Thousands of them. Some visible, most not. Servants moved through the building before dawn and after midnight, cleaning, repairing, carrying, heating, extinguishing. Their names were rarely recorded. Their presence was assumed, not acknowledged. Every day began with maintenance. Fires had to be lit long before the king woke. Versailles was vast and cold, its stone retaining winter as efficiently as it retained grandeur. Firewood arrived constantly, hauled in carts from forests stripped slowly but steadily to satisfy a building that refused to be warm on its own. One estimate places annual firewood consumption in the tens of thousands of tons. Wood burned not for comfort, but for survival. Even then, rooms remained drafty. Breath condensed in the air. Servants learned to work with numb fingers. Above, tapestries muted the cold. Below, it settled into bones. Water posed a different problem. Versailles sat on land that offered little of it. To fill the fountains, to wash the linens, to supply kitchens that fed thousands daily, water had to be forced uphill, against gravity, against logic. The machine de Marly was constructed for this purpose, an engineering marvel and a human catastrophe. 14 massive water wheels turned day and night, driven by the Seine. Hundreds of pumps strained constantly, their wooden components swelling, cracking, breaking under pressure. Maintenance never ended. Workers repaired while the machine ran. Accidents were frequent. Fingers crushed. Bodies caught. Lives lost without ceremony. The machine was loud. Relentless. Unforgiving. So was the palace it served. Food arrived in staggering quantities. Entire villages existed to supply Versailles with bread, meat, wine, vegetables, spices. Kitchens worked continuously, roasting, boiling, slicing, seasoning for banquets where abundance became performance. Waste followed. Human waste. Versailles had no modern sanitation. Chamber pots were emptied into courtyards, stairwells, gardens. Smell was constant, masked by perfume, flowers, ritual. Servants carried what the palace produced and disposed of it quietly, endlessly, invisibly. Disease thrived. Crowding did not stop at the nobility. Servants slept wherever space allowed. Attics. Corridors. Shared rooms. Illness moved quickly. Treatment was inconsistent. Replacement was easy. The palace did not grieve. Money flowed toward Versailles like blood toward a wound that never closed. Taxes increased steadily, disproportionately affecting those far from the court. Peasants rarely saw the palace, but they felt it. In levies. In conscription. In grain shortages that worsened when resources were redirected to feed spectacle. Ledgers recorded numbers, not hunger. One year blended into the next. Construction never truly stopped. Expansion, renovation, replacement. What had been built 10 years earlier was now insufficient. Fashion changed. Taste shifted. Power required novelty. Servants aged quickly. Craftsmen labored for decades on details few would notice. Gilders applied gold leaf thinner than skin. Carpenters shaped wood into ornament meant to be admired, not touched. Their work survived them. Their bodies did not. Names disappeared. What remained was repetition. Sweep. Carry. Repair. Replace. Above, celebration continued uninterrupted. Music masked effort. Light concealed fatigue. Ceremony suggested ease. The palace presented itself as effortless, as natural as sunrise. But effort was constant. Versailles did not create wealth. It absorbed it. It did not produce stability. It demanded it. Every improvement required more hands. Every hand required food. Every mouth required grain. Every demand rippled outward, touching places and people who would never stand beneath chandeliers or walk through mirrors. They would never see what their labor upheld. And they were never meant to. The success of Versailles depended on distance. Distance between the seen and the unseen. Between upstairs and downstairs. Between dream and machinery. Between power and cost. The machine beneath could not stop. To stop would mean decay. To stop would mean collapse. So it continued, grinding time, labor, and lives into maintenance. Not conquest. Not glory. Maintenance. And maintenance is the most invisible form of power. Because when something works, no one asks how. The world did not collapse around Versailles. It tightened. At first, the strain was distant enough to ignore. A poor harvest here. A shortfall there. Numbers adjusted on paper. New taxes introduced with familiar language, temporary, necessary, patriotic. The palace absorbed resources as it always had, indifferent to the tremors moving beneath the countryside. From Versailles, France still appeared obedient. But obedience was thinning. Louis XIV's wars stretched longer than planned, consumed more men than promised, returned less glory than expected. Armies marched across Europe, draining treasuries already weakened by maintenance masquerading as magnificence. Each campaign added weight to a system that had been designed to impress, not to bend. Versailles did not change. It could not. To reduce spectacle would be to admit vulnerability. To simplify would be to reveal the machinery. The palace was trapped by its own success. Grandeur had become obligation. By the early 18th century, the numbers no longer aligned quietly. Debt accumulated in layers, hidden by creative accounting and royal authority. Ministers changed. Strategies shifted. The structure remained. Outside the palace gates, prices rose. Bread, the simplest measure of stability, became unreliable. When bread disappeared, patience followed. Hunger sharpened memory. The memory of who paid, and who did not. Versailles still hosted ceremonies. Still staged rituals of abundance. Still required upkeep that felt increasingly obscene to those who funded it unknowingly. Distance had protected the palace for decades. Now information traveled faster. Anger followed routes once reserved for grain and soldiers. The Sun King died, but the system lived on. His successors inherited not only a throne, but an expectation. Versailles could not be undone. It could only be inhabited. Louis XV and Louis XVI moved through rooms heavy with intention they had not authored. They maintained rituals whose meanings had thinned with repetition. The palace continued to demand visibility even as authority eroded. Wars returned, this time less victorious. France's involvement in conflicts abroad, including the American War of Independence, drained the treasury further. Ironically, a war fought in the name of liberty accelerated the financial suffocation of a monarchy built on control. Numbers became desperate. Tax exemptions protected the nobility. The burden fell downward, as it always had. The countryside bore it. The cities absorbed it. The palace remained insulated, but not invisible. Whispers grew louder. Pamphlets circulated. Jokes sharpened into accusations. The rituals of Versailles, once envied, became symbols. Not of strength, but of indifference. Not of order, but of excess sustained by distance. Still, no single moment broke the spell. There was no thunderclap. No dramatic failure of walls or fountains. Just delay. Meetings postponed. Reforms discussed and diluted. Half measures applied too late. Versailles remained frozen in ceremony while the world outside recalculated its tolerance. The machine beneath strained audibly now. Repairs cost more. Labor demanded wages. Supplies fluctuated. Maintenance became harder to justify, harder to hide. The palace had been built to remove unpredictability. It now embodied it. By the late 1780s, the numbers could no longer be disguised. The state was functionally bankrupt. Confidence collapsed before structure did. Trust evaporated faster than money. When the Estates General was summoned in 1789, it was not held at Versailles by accident. The palace was meant to remind delegates of hierarchy, tradition, permanence. Instead, it reminded them of imbalance. Versailles watched as language changed. As subjects became citizens. As obedience became negotiation. The palace, once the center of gravity, began to feel heavy, slow, outdated. The turning world did not storm Versailles immediately. It simply stopped believing in it. And when belief disappears, architecture loses its spell. The palace still stood. The fountains still waited. The mirrors still reflected. But outside, something irreversible had shifted. The dream was no longer admired. It was counted. Versailles did not fall. It was emptied. When the royal family left the palace in October 1789, escorted back to Paris by a crowd that no longer feared distance or ceremony, there was no fire, no final speech, no dramatic destruction. Doors closed. Rooms darkened. Objects remained exactly where they had been placed for a world that had ceased to exist. The palace stood intact, but its purpose vanished overnight. Silence returned, not the controlled silence of ritual, but the hollow kind that follows abandonment. Dust settled on surfaces designed to be polished daily. Tapestries dulled. Fires went cold. The endless rhythm of maintenance faltered, then stopped. Versailles, for the first time, was still. Revolution does not always destroy symbols. Sometimes it repurposes them. In the years that followed, the palace became inconvenient. Too large to ignore. Too expensive to maintain. Too symbolic to demolish. Ideas shifted faster than stone. While regimes rose and fell, Versailles waited, suspended between condemnation and usefulness. Rooms once reserved for private audiences became storage. Halls built for ceremony hosted administrative functions. The palace learned to serve without ruling. Objects were sold. Furniture dispersed across Europe. Artifacts entered private collections, museums, markets. What could be moved was removed. What remained was stripped of context. The palace lost not just wealth, but intimacy. It became hollowed out, its meaning fragmented. When Napoleon considered Versailles, he saw potential but not comfort. Power had changed shape. Mobility mattered more than permanence. Versailles was too heavy, too rooted, too symbolic of a past that no longer obeyed. So it waited again. In the 19th century, the palace was reborn as a museum. Not a home. Not a seat of power. A narrative. The Museum of the History of France, created to unify memory, to smooth over fractures by presenting continuity where rupture had occurred. Versailles became an argument. Walls once designed to intimidate now instructed. Visitors walked paths curated to produce reflection rather than submission. The palace began to explain itself, cautiously, selectively. History replaced authority. But explanation comes at a cost. To preserve Versailles, it had to be frozen. Living spaces became exhibits. Objects became representations. Rooms stopped evolving. They became permanent approximations of a moment that never truly existed as it is now remembered. Maintenance returned, but differently. Now, it was conservation. Restoration. Preservation. Specialists replaced servants. Budgets replaced tribute. The palace no longer consumed resources unquestioned, it justified them through culture, tourism, national identity. The machine beneath reactivated, but with new language. Versailles hosted treaties now, not kings. In 1919, the Hall of Mirrors witnessed the signing of a peace that planted the seeds of another war. The room absorbed the weight silently, indifferent to the irony. It had always been a place where power performed itself. Intentions changed. Function adapted. The stone remained. What Versailles lost was its illusion of inevitability. It became optional. A site you could visit, interpret, critique, ignore. A monument that required explanation rather than obedience. Power had moved elsewhere, into institutions less visible, less architectural, harder to photograph. Versailles learned humility without choosing it. Today, it exists as a burden carefully carried. Millions pass through each year, their footsteps echoing through spaces once restricted to a few. The palace survives through attention now, not authority. Through tickets, not taxes. It has been transformed from command into memory. And memory, unlike power, does not demand belief. It asks for interpretation. In winter, Versailles returns to itself. The crowds thin. Voices soften. The palace exhales a silence that feels older than tourism, older than revolution. Snow gathers again on stone that has learned patience. The gardens blur. Geometry fades. The building becomes less a destination and more a presence. Inside, the mirrors reflect fewer bodies now. They reflect ceilings. Light. Absence. The hall of mirrors still stretches reality into repetition, but what it multiplies today is not power. It is time. Each reflection holds another moment that has already passed. Treaties. Footsteps. Echoes of performances no longer understood by those who performed them. Versailles survives because it is maintained. Not because it is loved. Not because it is believed in. Because budgets are approved. Because roofs must be repaired. Because stone cracks if ignored. Maintenance returns again and again as the palace's true legacy. Not conquest. Not culture. Maintenance. Every year, specialists calculate decay. Wood warps. Paint flakes. Gold leaf dulls. Water infiltrates walls that were never designed to endure centuries. The palace resists time only through effort. Through labor. Through money quietly redirected to prevent collapse. Nothing here is eternal. That was the lie. Visitors stand where kings once stood and feel small, as intended. But the feeling passes quickly. The spell weakens when one knows the cost. When one senses the machinery beneath the beauty. When admiration gives way to calculation. How many hands built this? How many fed it? How many never saw it? The answers are incomplete. They always will be. Versailles cannot tell you who paid for it. It can only show you what was purchased. Stone does not keep receipts. Architecture absorbs guilt and releases all. It survives by redirecting attention upward. Ceilings. Chandeliers. Mirrors. The opening image returns. Snow on gold. Silence on scale. The palace stands unchanged, but the world around it no longer bends. Power has moved into places without facades. Systems without mirrors. Mechanisms harder to see than fountains or halls. Versailles remains as evidence. Not of greatness, but of belief. Belief that beauty could stabilize power. Belief that scale could silence dissent. Belief that permanence could be constructed. It asks nothing now. It simply waits to be interpreted. And perhaps that is its final cost. Not money. Not labor. But attention. Because as long as we stand in its halls, measuring ourselves against its size, wondering how it was built and who suffered quietly beneath it, the palace continues to do what it was always designed to do. Command space. Shape memory. Distract from the unseen. This was never just about a house. It was about how much a society is willing to give, slowly, invisibly, repeatedly, to sustain an idea that no longer belongs to anyone. And whether, next time, we will recognize the price before the mirrors are finished.